Right, okay. So last week I gave them 3 options, and the most popular one was show some more substance kind of things. And the second one was lighting, and then the third one was kind of modelling, which is almost the complete opposite to the Friday group. So we're going to cover a little bit of substance today. I don't want to spend too long on this because I want to give you as much time as possible to do your assignment. But so I thought to myself, okay, what can I do in substance that will be useful? And I thought, well, just going through the process I think always helps. It just sort of secures it in your memory. But also I hadn't covered things like transparency. I had sort of covered emission, sort of glowing objects a little bit with certain particular people. But we certainly hadn't looked at opacity or transparency and emission. So, right, in Maya, I made a simple little scene, and I thought, right, I'll model this little oil lamp type thing, because then that'll have a glass bit, and it will also have a glowing kind of flame bit. My flame is rubbish. All I've done for a flame is just like a little sort of teardrop or raindrop sort of shape just there, but you'll get the idea. So, at the moment, when I render it, it looks like this. It looks like this when my... Yeah, there we go. The reason I put these is so that they'll be visible through the transparency and reflections and stuff. So these brightly coloured cylinders are just so you can see through, and so that I know and that you can see that the transparency will work on this bit. Right, so first things first, and I've automatically laid out the UVs for this, and this will actually come up in a bit, and I'll show you one of the potential problems with auto UV unwrapping. So right, first things first, export it. So select it, export selection, and I'll put it in my favorite bit, assets of this project, and I'll just call it oil lamp. Check my settings here. Yeah, I just want smooth mesh. That should be enough. That should be fine. Now into substance. So the usual is yeah, that's right, template. Let's select the oil lamp. I'm not going to change the document resolution because you can, as it says, it can be changed later. You can change this when you actually export the textures. Just go OK. So after a while, there's my oil lamp looking wonderful there. So the first things first, we have to bake the textures. And as usual, because we're not doing a sort of high resolution mesh to low resolution mesh, we don't have to worry about normals. And I haven't set up any ID version of the model, so you can click that off. But everything else I'll leave on. I think I'm also going to leave on the output size. It's going to be fairly low res for this, but I don't mind because I just want it to go fairly quick for now. So let's bake those textures. And there it is. That's baked. You can sort of see the slight ambient occlusion as usual gets applied to it. And more importantly, you can see all your textures here, and you can tap B to see what's in your channels at the moment. You can see the curvature, you saw the ambient occlusion just then, and the position and the thickness. And then when you're happy, when you look through those and you're thinking, yeah, everything's looking right, you type M to go back to the normal material. Right. First things first then, I want to get, or actually second now, I want to get transparency working on this glass bit just here. Now, by default, when you start up Substance and you start a new project using that template that we use, we don't actually have a transparency channel, or as they call it, an opacity channel. We've just got color, height, roughness, metallic, and normal. So how do we get some transparency working here? We actually have to add a new channel. So down here in texture set settings, above your bake textures, you can see your channels as they are at the moment. And you also see this little plus sign just here. If you click the plus, you've got a whole bunch of extra channels that you can add. You've even got these user-defined channels here that can be kind of anything. I'm going to add opacity. And I'm also going to add, so opacity will allow us to control transparency. And I'm also going to add emissive, because I've got that little glowing flame kind of object in there. So now I've got these extra channels. And you can see down here, now I've got the option of adding opacity and emission to any one of my layers. Let's try making a glass kind of shader then. So what is the glass is going to be? It's going to have maybe some. Well, I'll create a new fill layer, and I'll call this glass. And I'll do what I like to do. I'll immediately put it into a group. So I'll Control G, and I might call this glass group or glass group. And then I'm going to add a white or add a black mask. Add a paint, and I'm going to apply it to just this part. And because this model was made of a bunch of different models that were then all grouped together and combined, it means that Substance is going to be able to tell that that part here, the glass sort of bulb part, was originally a separate object. So I'll be able to mesh fill it just here by this little button here. So if I click that, I can just click this like that. I can just check it by holding down Alt. Yep, that's all nicely done there. I mean, you could also check it by deliberately giving your glass a strange color, so you can see that's working like that. Right, so here's what we can fill this with. So I don't want to bother filling it with any normalness or emission or metalness, because this is glass. And you know what? I don't even want to fill it with height either. I just want to fill it with color, roughness, and opacity. So I'm going to make the color just kind of white, like that. And here's the opacity. So at the moment, the opacity is at full, so it's got 100% opacity. So to get it looking less opaque and more translucent or transparent, you should be able to just lower this, right? And this will start becoming see-through. Let's see what happens. No difference yet. Maybe you have to lower it even more. Nope. Nope. In fact, if you take it down to nothing, so it's got 0 opacity, it still doesn't actually show up like that. This is the first thing that will potentially catch you out. So I want to sort of head this thing off at the pass and show you why this doesn't work. This doesn't work because the shader in Substance, remember Substance has its own kind of shading kind of system, I mean, which fairly closely is the same as the Arnold kind of one. But by default, the shader that Substance is using doesn't use any transparency. You have to tell it to. And the way you change that is you change the shader. And that is in Viewer Settings. So you go to Viewer Settings here. So normally you'll probably be looking at Texture Settings. You've got Display Settings and you've got Viewer Settings. And what you want is in Viewer Settings. And then you want to change this thing here, the shader. So by default, it's PBR Metal Rough. If you click that, you've got a bunch of other different shaders you can use here. The one we want, we got two ones with alpha. We've got alpha test and alpha blending. We want the alpha blending one. Well, suddenly our opacity works. So that is the very, very first thing to remember. If you want anything, if you want to fiddle around with opacity and transparency, you will not be able to see it in Substance unless you go into Viewer Settings and you change the shader just by clicking that button, and you change it to the alpha blending. Then your opacity slider will work. Right, so what is glass then? So now we can properly define what our glass is. So glass is going to be almost completely transparent. So I'm going to lower the opacity down to a very, very small number. And it's probably going to be quite shiny as well. So I'm going to lower the roughness until it's down to like that. Unfortunately, of course, in some ways, because this is an array tracer, we can't really see the reflection working too well unless I kind of move the opacity back up. Then you can see the roughness working better. Not that it matters too much, because obviously glass is mostly transparent. So we're going to lower that opacity down like this and make it almost zero roughness as well. And we're going to call that glass glossy. I'm going to do the usual method of sort of building up our own kind of materials by creating a sort of a two-layered kind of thing going on, a glossy and a rough version. So I'm going to duplicate my glossiness, my glossy glass layer. I'm going to call this one rough. And this one I'm going to make quite a bit rougher. And I'm also going to make it less opaque, because I figure where it's rougher, it's going to be essentially scratched. And when you scratch glass, it tends to lose its transparency. if you look at it in the real world. So I'm going to lift this up a little bit. Not too much. I still want it to be transparent, but I'm going to lift it up a little bit. So now I've got a rough version of the glass on top of the glossy version of the glass, and so I need to blend this with black mask, and I'm going to go into a fill. I'm going to add a fill here, and in my grayscale I can type in something like scratches. Hopefully there will be some procedural kind of scratch textures here. So I want something, I actually want something more like that. So I want something almost completely black, but with lots of little scratch marks on it. So I'm going to click that, and you can straight away see the scratches there, but they're a bit too big, you know. So if I look at that and go to the paint layer, you know, the scale's a bit off. So first things first, I'm going to pull this down like that, or pull this up actually, to make the scale repeat. Now, this also brings me on to something that, again, I've brought up with some of you, but I don't know whether I've tackled it actually in a lecture. Now, you can see the seam here where the scratch is. The reason that's happening is because I auto UV'd the whole lot, which meant that there were essentially 6 projections from left, right, up, down, back, front happening. And where those kind of meet, you know, imagine it, one coming from that side, one coming from that side, you're going to see a seam just here. You can kind of get rid of that seam by going to the projection method here. Now, by default, it's going to use UVs, which is the UVs that you made in Maya. But if you click that, you can change that to something called triplanar projection. If you do that, what's going to happen is that Substance is kind of going to do its own version of the automatic UVing, but it's going to do it a little bit better, and it's going to blend between where these seams match up. So if you ever notice big major seams happening in your textures, that's going to be, you can sort of fix that with triplanar projection, but it also brings me to the point of why in some cases it's a better idea to manually do your own UVs on an object. But that's maybe a little bit more advanced, maybe not necessary for this semester, because Substance will allow you to skirt around that issue quite a lot by using this triplanar kind of version here. So let's go back, have a look at this. So I've got a few scratches going on here on my glass. I reckon I could still make this a little bit more, a little smaller. I want lots of little fine kind of scratches kind of going on my glass like that. That looks kind of cool. So that's the opacity part of the glass sorted out. What about adding some dust to the glass? So I'm going to add another new fill layer. Remember, because it goes on top, it's going to completely override what we've already seen. I'm going to double click this and say dust. And again, I don't want to paint with anything other than, in this case, color and roughness. So I'm going to click everything else off. Actually, no, I want to put my opacity in there and have the opacity at full. Sorry. So I'm going to change the color of the dust to be a sort of sandy, dull, kind of sandy kind of color like that. And remember, dust is almost completely rough. You know, it's going to have no specularity on it at all. And in this case, I want to mix it using a smart mask. Now, I know that there's quite a few nice little dust smart masks just here. And the one I want to use is, let's have a look. I'm going to use one that's kind of a bit occlusion-y. I think I might use this occlusion one, see what this looks like. Because I want the dust to just kind of collect in like the crevices just here where it meets. So I'm going to chuck that one on like that. Yeah, that's quite nice. That's going to give it, yeah, that's brilliant actually. That's going to give me dust sort of that's going to collect around these areas where like the metal presses up against the glass. So that's looking not too bad. I mean, ideally you'd spend a lot longer doing this. And I just want to fill in the rest now because I don't want to spend too long doing this. I want to give you as much time as possible, and I can get carried away sometimes in trying to make it look good when I should just be demoing it. Right, so for the rest, I'm going to do now the flame, the emission part. So I'm going to create another fill layer. This fill layer I'm going to move out of the group. And again, I'm going to immediately just group it. I'm going to call this flame group. And this one is going to be called flame, like that. And I'll add a black mask just here. And I only want this to go onto the flame. Now, it's going to be tricky now, because how on earth do I get in there and select that part of the flame, because it's behind the glass. If I go to, if I add my paint and I add my bit just here, as I try and select polygons, I'm going to be selecting the other parts of the glass just here, so it's a bit tricky. So this is where an ID map would come in useful if I'd set this up. But you can still do it without an ID map by utilizing the 2D view. So if I go into 3D and 2D view, this is my UV layout that I'm looking at just here. Now, if I switch back to Maya, I can quickly see which shells, which UV shells, match up to which part of the objects. Now, I kind of already sort of know this in a way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the flame an obviously different kind of color. I'm going to make it bright red. So this will show up. Go back into the mask of my group. And I know that these bits here are my flames. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to polygon fill. Actually, I wonder whether UV chunk would do it. Let's see if UV chunk would do it. Yeah, it will. That's good. So you can just click the UV chunk and it will select that. So this is a way of getting to parts of your model that might actually be pretty tricky to reach, because you can do everything on this 2D flattened UV version of the model as well. So I'm going to set that as well. What are the parts? There's this bit, I think. And I might actually have to go into, oh no, that bit. And where's the final bit? I'm going to go back into Maya to find these UV chunks. So if I go to the UV editor, and I want to select by shell. There's that one. Now with Maya I can get in here. Oh, there it is, just there. So it's that little bit there. Okay. Oh, there it is, yeah. There's that bit. And I think just a couple more bits to go. Let's have another look in here. Oh, gosh, look at that. Okay, so there's that bit there. Actually, I wonder whether I can zoom into it. Maybe I can zoom into here. Nope, I can't. And where's the other bit? What's that bit there? There. Okay. There. I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave it like that. Otherwise, it's going to be too boring me trying to get each little bit. Anyway, so I've masked off most of what makes the flame up, with the exception of that one little, those two little bits there. So now I'm going to make that glow. So the way we make it glow is we control the emission of it, or the emissive qualities of it. So again, I'm going to switch off all the bits I don't want here. I don't want any height, I don't want any rough, any metal, any normalness, I don't want any opacity. I just want color and emission. Although, to be honest, I could probably get away with just emission. But I'm going to give them both the same colors, just so I've got the option of controlling them independently. So I'm going to make this a kind of flame kind of color like that. And then for emission, I'm going to choose the same one, just like that. So now this is actually glowing. When I output a map, this will be glowing. So that's transparency and emission done. And then for the rest of it, I'm just going to chuck on a smart material so I can get it into Maya quick and show you how to attach this all up. I'm going to use bronze armor. I think bronze armor is the one I found out looked okay for the rest of it, like that. That's quite handy. So I don't even have to mask that off at the moment. Again, you're going to see, can you see the seam that happens just here? The reason that happens is just down here, this finish rough. Unfortunately, this finish rough doesn't have a setting to change it from triplanar from UVs, so you're kind of stuck with it using your UVs. If you switch it off, it gets rid of that seam. Unfortunately, it also kind of gets rid of some of that roughness for you, but I'm going to switch it off for now. So there it is, done in Substance. Now to export this into Maya. So remember, you can right-click anywhere in Substance Painter and go Export Textures. I'm going to make my own configuration again because this time I'm exporting opacity and emission. So I'm going to go into Configuration, select the default kind of output here, and let's have a look. Actually, I'm going to add, actually I should be able to just add this. So I'm going to add into here, I'm going to add grey, and I can get rid of grayscale here, and I use this little dollar sign here to quickly make it match up with the rest of the stuff here, or I guess I could probably copy and paste it, but I can go mesh underscore texture set underscore, and I'll call this one opacity. And what I want to do here is I want to find opacity and drag and drop this onto that little grey bit just here, and I'm going to put it as grey channel. So when I hover over that, you'll see that opacity now has been mapped to a grey channel. So it's going to export, it's going to give me another texture called opacity, and I'm going to make an emissive one. Now emissive is going to be RGB because that contains colour information. So click that one. Again, get rid of that. Let's see if I can copy and paste this. I should be able to. There we go. That's a bit easier, isn't it? I'm going to call this one emissive. And I'll find emissive. There it is. And drag and drop that. And go, yeah, I want that on the RGB channels. So this is now ready to export all of these channels here. So we go to here. And there we are. These are the channels that are going to get exported. So, right, let's go to the right folder, which is obviously always in our project. Substance Part 2, source images. I might actually put this in a subfolder. Oil lamp. And I'll export it at 2K. Shouldn't take too long. There we go, brilliant. And there are my textures, excellent. Right, so back into Maya. There's a couple of things, extra things you've got to do if you're doing, especially if you're doing opacity, if you're doing transparency. Emissive, not so difficult, but obviously they want to try and catch you out with opacity. Your opacity, your transparency won't show up correctly in Maya unless you select the object that's going to have some transparency on it. You go into the attribute editor and you open up the Arnold drop-down and you click off opaque. So now Arnold is going to consider your object not necessarily opaque. Now the reason this is switched on is that Arnold, when it renders, does a bunch of clever little shortcuts by assuming that most objects aren't opaque. And by assuming that most objects aren't opaque, it can do these shortcuts and can render quicker. So you kind of have to, it's like an opt-in policy of everything being opaque, and you have to opt out specifically by clicking that off. So that's, you have to do that, otherwise your shadows won't turn up correctly. If you do that, you should theoretically still see transparency, but if you look at your shadows, they'll be pitch black because the rays won't be able to go through it, the light rays won't be able to pass through it. So remember that bit first. And then you have to do a couple of extra things when you're applying the texture maps in the shader. So let's go to Hypershade. And let's see, let's create a new one. Might as well. So standard, little triangle buttons just here, and we'll call this oil lamp matte. For much of this, it's the same old setup. So weight up to 1 on base color, and then little checkerboard, file, into oil lamp and base color. And we don't have to do anything else. sRGB is the correct setting for that. Metalness, that has to become, that does have to become raw, obviously. So metallic goes into there. And then we have to go raw. And alpha is luminance. Actually, I just want to very, very briefly talk about metallicness. Be wary when you be wary of making too many of your objects metallic. A properly metallic object will only look good and realistic if it's got plenty to reflect. Now it looks okay up here because the whole object's just encompassed by a nice HDR map, an environment map that gives it nice reflections. A couple of people, certainly last semester, were making their objects, their exterior Mars-based objects, metallic, but they were looking really black, they were looking really dark in the render. That's because there wasn't actually much to reflect. They were sort of in a void. So if your metallic objects don't look as good as you think they're going to look, or they look better in Substance and they look better here, but when you actually render, they look really black, that's because there isn't actually enough to reflect. And this is a peculiar and specific and unique property of the metallic kind of shading kind of system. So yeah, be wary of that. About if you're gonna, it shouldn't make as much difference with your interiors because you're in completely enclosed spaces. So your metallic object should have plenty to reflect. But just have that in the back of your head. Metallic objects will tend to look quite dark if they haven't got the right amount of stuff to reflect. Right, back to here again. So we've done metallicness, then we need to do roughness. And again, that has to be raw. And alpha is luminance. Let's do bump. Let's do the normal map. So we tab, then type bump, and then it's the first one there. It's that bump 2D. Connect that up to normal camera. Change it from bump to tangent space. And find our normal map. And again, that has to be raw. But alpha is luminance has already been clicked on for us. Handily. We want to go back into that bump node and click that little button here that gives us the attribute editor view so that we can go down to Arnold and switch off this flip G and flip R. Right, so now we need to we'll do emissive first because emissive is at least much more straightforward. So if you go back into your main shader here, the oil lamp shader, and you scroll down, you'll see emission just here. You want to connect it to the color, and this connects a lot like the base color in the fact that you just select your emissive and you don't have to change this from sRGB to raw. It can just be what it is, just there. The one thing that you will need to do though, or is useful to know, is that emissive won't show up unless you give it an actual weight. Think of the texture map as being deciding what the color of your glowing object is going to be, and the weight is how intense that glow is going to be. So you can see actually a little bit of it beginning to appear on the underside of this test object. And also remember that this weight number can go above 1. And you see how it gets brighter and brighter. It can go, it's almost, I think, unbounded. It can go up to any kind of number. But that's going to kick out a lot of actual light. So, and that can cause these things called fireflies, which are these super bright little speckly dots that appear all over your scene. But that's what you do with emissive to make that work. So you put it in the color, but then you actually have to give it some weight. Just think value, just think amount of glow. Okay, now the important one, the transparency. So transparency, the opacity, goes into the weight of the transmission here. Transmission means how much light can be transmitted through the object, which is just a fancy over-the-top way of saying transparency. So again, we go into the weight here, and we go to File, and we choose our opacity, which it didn't export. Why didn't that export? Let me just go back into Substance. So let's not. Did I just not choose it? I didn't choose it, did I? I didn't choose my own one. I chose the default one. So I want this one just here. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to re-export that. Cool. Okay, that's done. Back into here. Okay, there we go. There's our opacity. So we load up our opacity, and you can see, actually, maybe this was a good way of explaining it. We put this into the weight slider that was at 0, which meant that there was no transparency there. So what it's going to do is going to map that black and white to that weight slider. So to go into here, select our opacity. Now, this has to be raw. But what's different about this one is that alpha's luminance must be left off. So it's raw, but that has to be off. And that should be ready to go. So let's have a look. Let's apply this, the oil lamp matte, to our oil lamp model. And there we go. I'm a bit worried about the fact that it's not showing a transparency there, but let's see if it's just a viewport thing. Let's see if it shows up in the render. No, everything's getting the same texture there. Okay, something's gone a bit screwy. Okay, we're back again. Just so I catch this on the recording, if you're mixing transparent objects with opaque objects, and in Substance, your opaque material sits on top of the glass material, make sure that you correctly apply a mask to your opaque material, and that mask has only the bits of the object that you want to be opaque in that mask. If you don't do that, and you bring in you export the textures and bring those textures into Maya, it'll all be opaque and you'll lose your glass material. But if you do that, then it will work fine. And so remember that in Maya, the important settings for opacity are that it's, oops, I should actually make this raw, is that it should be raw, because it's just a black and white image, and that importantly, alpha's luminance is off. But everything else, yeah, it should be fine. And then apply emission to the emissive, just as sRGB. And that's how you mix up opaque materials, transparent materials, and glowing, emissive kind of materials. Okay, cool. Right. You can get on, obviously, now with the rest of your assignment. I'll come around and answer any questions. And next week, we'll take a brief look at some slightly more advanced, I suppose, lighting that could work with your Mars base, especially if you're going to do, if your Mars bases have nice big windows, then what I'm going to show next week with lighting might come in very useful for that. Okay, thanks guys. Obviously you can take a break whenever you feel like it during these sessions.